Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about UHF from 1989. And this is the winner of my Patreon movie review raffle for June, and it was chosen by Leo M. If you would like to pick a movie for me to review, then click on the link for my Patreon, where the movie review raffle is one of the rewards, and maybe the movie you pick will be the winner next month. UHF was always a favorite of mine growing up. Obviously, if you were a Weird Al fan, you definitely checked out UHF, and as a 12 and 13-year-old, I was very much a Weird Al fan. But it's also the kind of perfect movie comedy for a 12-year-old boy. When at my local video store I was banned from really renting anything above my age in terms of ratings, UHF I actually could rent because of that. Although I keep reading it was PG-13, but I remember being able to rent it, so I remember it being PG, but whatever. And it was always kind of a favorite. You could watch it with your brother and sister. It was always really hilarious. I loved all the parodies. I would quote it to my friends. To me, it was a hit until I learned it wasn't. And kind of to everyone I grew up with, it was a hit. It was like this huge touchstone. It was this fun, hilarious cult movie that didn't really matter like what kind of humor it was. I've never met anyone who really thought this movie wasn't funny. And it kind of embodies the kind of humor of Weird Al, and what's made him such an enduring pop culture icon is all kind of wrapped up in this movie, and particularly during his 80s period, basically, because mainly chronologically, but also right before maybe his first or sort of second comeback in the 90s with Smells Like Nirvana. To me, it was always like a really fun, enjoyable movie. I don't know why people didn't like it at the time. I've never really gotten that, because even though this movie isn't perfect, it's weak in terms of plot and script, it's still a lot of fun. Like, I don't particularly love the Indiana Jones parody at the beginning, but after that, I'm all with it. I'm laughing hysterically throughout it. I love the sketches. I like how it all works out together. I like a lot of the performances. To me, there's more to like than there was not to like, really. It's just a really enjoyable, kind of fun, semi-safe comedy for 12-year-olds that just doesn't really get old. It has that kind of Mad Magazine spirit in a way that kind of the Zucker brothers do, but this feels so much more Mad Magazine than even the Zucker brothers. It has that kind of surrealism that good kind of visual comedy usually has, but it doesn't get too into that. It feels very fun. Like, even having things like Gandhi 2 or Conan the Librarian, they feel very fun. It just feels like, oh my god, I can't believe somebody's doing that, but in that way for like when you're 10 or 11 or something. And I think it embodies the Weird Al audience so well. It's just amazing, and I've always really loved it for that. I don't own every Weird Al album, and I haven't heard every Weird Al album, but all of them till 96, because I was really into it for a little bit. But I still have always come back to UHF and be able to laugh and laugh, and it just, to me, is one of the best examples of Weird Al, and best examples, honestly, of 80s comedy. And I understand why it became a cult classic, because as soon as I started watching it and really got into it, I started remembering why I had so much love for it, and it kind of brought me right back into loving Weird Al and laughing again at UHF. An imaginative dreamer played by Weird Al named George, who has gone from one job to another because he's always daydreaming or getting into trouble, until he is fired from his job at a burger place, and then suddenly, after he goes to a party after that, finds out that his uncle owns the deed to a UHF station and lets George and his friend Bob run the UHF station, and they try to figure out ways to kind of revamp it and bring it from the brink of bankruptcy, which it has been for quite a while. They start doing news with Pamela Finkelstein, who is played by Fran Drescher, and they accidentally step onto a huge hit with Stanley Spadowski's kids show, Stanley Spadowski being played by Michael Richards, and suddenly become #1 in the ratings after the big hit of the kids show of Stanley Spadowski's show, and many other wacky premises and TV ads that go throughout it, until they have to try to fight back and win the station back, as his uncle owes $75,000 to a big gangster, and the big TV executive in town is about to buy them out and destroy the station and make it a parking lot. RJ Fletcher, played by Kevin McCarthy, and George and the people at UHF U62 have to find a way to get the station back and run a fundraiser to keep the station that the whole town loves going and remain being the big hit that it is. When it comes to UHF, I guess the general criticism, or even the things that Weird Al and the director of this film, Jay Levy, have pointed out, is maybe the plot of the film wasn't necessarily necessary, that they should have stuck to the parodies and the skits and not had this plot of them trying to save the UHF station conversation or have it be as frequent as it really was. And I hear what they're saying, that this should have been more like Kentucky Fried Movie, more of a skit film. I get the idea of that, and I think, you know, certainly the skits are the most memorable part and probably the best part of the movie, no offense. But I think you have to think of the target audience and what this film's really trying to achieve. And the thing about Kentucky Fried Movie and a skit movie, or like Monty Python's Meaning of Life or something like that, is that those are weird. Those are strange. Those are like not exactly safe movies. And this is a movie for 10 and 11-year-olds. And 10 and 11-year-olds don't like surreal, challenging films. They like things that are safe. And the plot of this is like, you know, the Save the Rec Center type of movie. I've done it. Everyone's done it. People like to save the rec center. It's a thing. You know, Break In 2 as well, for whatever reason. This plot is something that everyone is familiar with. It's not a challenging plot at all. And I'm kind of fine with it because I think this film wouldn't be what it is without it. You need that plot. And acting like not having it or not having it as much would make this film stronger. It might make it stronger in this weird way that isn't Weird Al. But Weird Al doesn't, like, no offense to Weird Al, he doesn't challenge his audience in that way. He's easier to take down. And that's not to say he's not a good artist or a good comedian, because he very much is. But I think when he's doing something like his first movie, he's not going to do something that artistically different. And I think in terms of what UHF is, it definitely works for that. And I think it is the kind of perfect movie it needs to be, structure and plot wise. Now, I understand this film wasn't critically loved at the time, and I think honestly a lot of it had to do with this film really wasn't for a lot of the critics, and their criticisms of it weren't exactly fair. I think a lot of times anything that was for the younger set or for younger teens just didn't do well with critics at the time, and I think they hugely misunderstood what was going on, particularly like cult-ish movies. It didn't feel like critics, especially the critics in the 80s like Siskel and Ebert, didn't really get that kind of a thing. That wasn't the thing they were going to like, and critics in the 80s kind of missed out on a lot of really great movies based on kind of shittier attitudes. I think UHF, they kind of missed out on something because it was just such a funny, silly comedy that the Zucker brothers were around and critics did like Airplane. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't like this film. Airplane's a little weirder, more adult. This is just very silly. I think in the skits it's creative, but it's kind of the humor that they weren't exactly liking, and I kind of wish they were a little more open to it. But most critics at the time, much like politics in the 80s, were fairly conservative in what they liked, and that's probably why they didn't like it. I think some of the criticisms were rather mean and unfair and went frankly way too far. This film was a box office bomb, and the narrative, and especially through Weird Al's Behind the Music, was that this film was on one of the biggest blockbuster movie summers of like ever. And 1989 was a big one. You had the original Batman, you had Lethal Weapon 2, you had Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, but it's not like those movies had opened the same weekend as UHF. UHF was the biggest wide release of that weekend. When Harry Met Sally actually was expanding, that was probably its biggest competition, but it wasn't really because that's not the same demographic. But in 1989, it was far more common for people to see films in the second, third, fourth, fifth week of release than it is now. I mean, people still see movies when they've been out for a while. It's far more common to see it opening weekend than it was then. People saw it opening weekend, but more people would see it throughout the release than do really now. And UHF opened 11th. I think maybe it was the times. I think UHF fell under a lot of that because the competition was so strong, and especially if you're someone who sees 4 or 5 movies a year and Batman looks super awesome and everyone's talking about it, you do want to see UHF, but you can only see one movie and you only have time to see one movie. And unfortunately, UHF had to wait for video. That worked out because UHF did have such a great reception on video, and as I was a kid at the time, my parents wouldn't always let me get new releases, and this was always like kind of an older movie. I think older releases were like $2, new releases were like $3 to $3.50 or something like that. I could always get this, and it was always like kind of that favorite where I was like, well, I like Weird Al, and then I just kept renting it over and over again. Me and my friends, I think, rented it from the video center around my area so many times. UHF was like a hot tape back in the day. And then of course it did really well on DVD, and I think it's made it more and more of a cult classic, and people kept rediscovering it because it's just so much fun. It's just a fun, good time of a comedy, and just the skits and all the, I mean, like Spatula City, what the hell is that? That's so funny. I do actually like Weird Al. I do think particularly early on in the film, it's like he's trying too hard, but you kind of get used to him. I think Michael Richards kind of steals the film. A lot of people don't want to talk about Michael Richards or Victoria Jackson in this film, basically because of what has happened since this movie. I like both of them, but particularly Michael Richards in this. I really like Kevin McCarthy. If you've seen Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I actually saw this before I saw Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I always love his delivery. I've always liked the randomness of Raoul, played by Trinidad Silva, who unfortunately died while making this movie, but I like the Wild Kingdom skit. It's just so random. I like the kind of random surrealness of it. That used to make me, I'd fall on the ground laughing at that one. I loved it so much. I didn't know about Philo, who's Anthony Gary, who was from General Hospital and the Luke and Laura era, which is way before my time. But I'm at least aware of that whole phenomenon and how that was actually a big deal in pop culture, and he couldn't really get a lot of movie roles, and he really liked doing something like this and doing something different. This role was offered to Joel Hodgson, and I think a lot of people think it would have been awesome if Joel Hodgson was in UHF, but at the time he was developing and making Mystery Science Theater, so you obviously know how I feel that he probably should have just developed Mystery Science Theater. But it is nice to dream he could have been in this, but I think Anthony Gary does a really good job as Philo, and I've seen him actually in other stuff before, and I was actually shocked. Like, out of all this time, I just found out that was the guy from Luke and Laura, and I was honestly shocked. I think that shows a lot of range, and I have a lot more respect for him as an actor. The fact that it's been going on this long, and I've known this movie this long, and I didn't know who it is, speaks volumes. I think the thing with UHF, it is kind of like a skit comedy movie for kids, but that doesn't mean it's a bad comedy. Far too many times, like, we think challenging comedy or R-rated comedy makes it better. That doesn't necessarily mean it's better. UHF is still incredibly funny. It's a very funny movie, and it's really good at satirizing comedy, and the whole idea of a UHF station, the randomness of it. I don't know how many of you watching this even grew up with UHF stations. I did. There were still UHF stations at the time. Some people say they were fading out. UHF stations kind of lasted until most of them, I think, got bought out when like UPN and WB happened and they needed more space, but they were still going on for quite a while and even into the late 90s. But it was just like where you'd get weird old movies, weird reruns, just stranger stuff would happen on there. If you like UHF, read the AV Club Oral History of UHF. It's really good, and I'll have a link in the description. The idea that this non-kind of corporate network kind of channel could be run by Weird Al works perfect for this. It kind of lends itself to having various parodies and movie parodies and show ideas and all sorts of skits that you can have within it. I guess maybe it could have worked a little better if the skits and the whole, like, the town loving it more reflected the town it lived in or something like that. Yeah, it's not the greatest made or written film in the world, but it still is very funny, and it really, really works, actually. While I was watching, I was like, yeah, this isn't the tightest movie, but it's still a really enjoyable movie. I understand why people would like it, because you're like, Conan the Librarian, oh my god, that's so there, so obvious, but it's so funny. It's like a surgeon. That seems like something that should be there. Weird Al, I think it goes into his whole school of comedy. It works how his music videos work, and it kind of actually, you know, Al TV, which was on MTV, anytime he'd have an album come out, he'd have this block where he'd play all his music videos, and he'd take over MTV for 2-3 hours. I taped the one at the time from around Bad Hair Day, and I heard he did them from the 80s on. I don't know how many times he did that, but it kind of works within his whole thing that this weird, crazy dork could run a TV channel, and all the fun that it was, and everything from the Al TV stuff to everything that made Weird Al great is that you can't believe you're having this much fun and this kind of dorky, silly fun that's kind of safe for families and stuff, but not like safe in that boring way. It's kind of like a very imaginative safe, and I think that's what made UHF such an enduring classic and let it grow and let you be able to grow up with it, because it's not something that's like holding its tongue in terms of its comedy. It's just so fucking funny. I mean, there's just no way not laugh at this movie. To me, it's one of the great comedies of the 80s. When I think of comedies I enjoy from the 80s, I usually do think of UHF, and there's a reason you grew up with it, because it was a movie that interests you. It made sense. It was all part of that thing. So if you were into Bad Hair Day or Smells Like Nirvana and you were like, I really like Weird Al, hey, he has a movie, oh man, this is just like the music videos. That's part of Weird Al's whole package. It's not just the music, it's the music videos, and I think this shows the kind of genius that was going on with him. And it's kind of Zucker Brothers in what it's doing, but this lets him bounce around through so many things. It lets him have the music video in the middle. I actually quite like that music video. I think it's a really funny movie. I like the premise of it, and it really has fun with its premise, like this little UHF station. It was kind of like a ragtag channel, and it makes sense to have a ragtag group of people led by Weird Al having a hit UHF station. And there could be hit UHF stations because it did feel like anything could happen, and especially in 80s TV, things were so predetermined and predictable. Going on a UHF station was where you could find the unexpected. It was like the YouTube of its day, and I think UHF reflects the kind of fun of a UHF's channel and plays with that premise in such an excellent way and works within in Weird Al's humor and just makes a really fun, amazing Weird Al comedy. Makes you wish that even though Orion apparently was acting like they might make more movies with Weird Al, especially because it's tested as well as RoboCop and all that stuff, that maybe he would have a cinematic career, and he didn't. And that's always a shame to me because I've always loved this film. It's not like he had another one and it wasn't so great, nobody likes it that much. It never happened. But if this is all there is, it's a glorious shot at cinematic comedy. It's not just an attempt. If this is what Weird Al left for cinema, he did a damn good job to just leave it and get out, because I've never not liked this movie. And much like the spirit of UHF and how everyone ends up liking it because of its fun, goofy spirit, I think there's no way you can turn down the fun, goofy spirit of UHF. So if you have seen UHF and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And again, if you would like for me to review a movie, the best chance of me actually reviewing that movie is if you enter the Patreon movie review raffle. Just click on the link below and it'll send you to my Patreon, where the movie review raffle is one of the rewards. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.